as many of you will know, nothing is left of Merton Priory. In 1538, it was razed to the ground in order to make Henry VIII's extraordinary palace of Nonsuch itself razed to the ground in the following century, but that's another story. The area subsequently became an industrial centre, and in the 19th century, a railway was driven through the priory, as happened elsewhere, for example, Lewes. In the 1980s, Sainsbury's bought the site, but before they could build on it, they had to pay for a major excavation. This wasn't the first excavation. Exactly 100 years ago, Colonel Harold Bidder uncovered the church. And in the 1970s, a further dig was led by an archaeologist who may be familiar to you, and that is Scott McCracken. Sorry, the previous, I missed a photograph, which is the railway being demolished. In the 1980s, the Museum of London archaeology lot moved in, and you can read all about their excavations and the previous excavations in the comprehensive write-up by Pat Miller and Dave Saxby. In fact, do please bombard the Museum of London with your requests to read this excellent tome, because it's out of print at the moment. So following modern custom, the railway was replaced with a road, but Sainsbury's did agree to put a bridge over the remains of the chapter house. After years of campaigning, a group of locals managed to get the funds to turn this rather inauspicious chamber into a museum. And this is where I come in, for one of those locals was my dad, who used to manage the craft market, Merton Abbey Mills, next door. He and I researched, wrote and designed all the display boards that you can see in the background. And it was during these researches that I realised something I hadn't quite twigged before, despite having 2 degrees in medieval history, that Merton Priory was underrepresented in historical literature. Apart from Miller and Saxby, the last book on Merton Priory was Alfred Heales's Records of Merton Priory, published nearly 150 years ago. Feeling that a doctorate was long overdue, I decided to write one on Merton. But the history of Merton Priory is too big for a thesis. I had to focus on one aspect. I might have chosen economic history, for Merton was a big business, but I'm no economic historian. I could have chosen the political relations of the Priory, which would make a really interesting thesis, and somebody has started to do something on this. I chose intellectual history, Merton Priory as a centre of learning, and that was really started by such whimsical fantasies with my good friend and colleague at Merton Historical Society, Peter Hopkins, on what the library might have looked like. I started my thesis in 2019, and I was still working with my dad on the museum. Now, if you're an adult, you can read the excellently written display boards and look at interesting old stones, although the Museum of London has nicked the choicest bits. But if you're a child, apart from playing with the dog, who you can see nestling in the right-hand corner, there's not a lot to do. So how to make Merton Priory attractive to the younger generation? Well, the obvious answer is virtual reality, but this can be complicated and expensive. However, there is a simple virtual solution, and that is Minecraft. For those of you without children or grandchildren who love it, Minecraft is virtual Lego. You can build structures, whole worlds, out of blocks, and then have adventures. Rather than take months learning how to use it, I thought it would be more efficient to kidnap a suitable teenager, and this I did, and it became an ideal lockdown project for my 14-year-old friend Thomas. I gave him a ground plan, and when they were open again, his dad dragged him around various cathedrals, and this was the product, or a bit of it. Well, one day, Thomas asked me, "So where's the library then?" This is an entirely reasonable question, and one that's actually quite pertinent to my thesis. The thing is that he couldn't see it on the ground plan. During my studies, I've spent a lot of time in these magnificent libraries, the Cambridge University Library and the British Library, lovingly designed by Giles Gilbert Scott and Colin St Wilson and M.J. Long. If you are Harry Potter, or perhaps more appropriately Hermione Granger, you might spend your time in Duke Humphrey's Library in Oxford, which originates from the 15th century. Another early Oxford library is that at Merton College, named after Merton Priory, and this one is chained, which reminds us of the value of early books. And if you've read or seen Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose, you'll remember the incredible library at the heart of it. I use the word incredible advisedly for its utter fantasy. The biggest library in Europe, as Brother William says, it was supposed to have held thousands of books. However, first of all, no medieval library was that big. The largest library in the British Isles, Christchurch, Canterbury, had only about 1,800 volumes. Secondly, the design of the library was actually modelled on a labyrinth in Rouen Cathedral, which acted as a virtual pilgrimage. So it wasn't a library at all. Rather delightfully now, you can see in this photo that Rouen Cathedral projects the labyrinth onto the spot where it once was. Nowadays, we think of a library as a physical space, but in the Middle Ages, a library was a collection of books. Before the 15th century, books weren't in a specific room, but were housed all over a monastery in armaria, aumbries or presses, book cupboards, like this one at Lilshall in Shropshire, or chests. And here's a medieval chest, which is actually from a parish church at Hindingham in Norfolk. So where to put Merton's library then? Well, first of all, service books would have been kept in the sacristy, which I think is in the south transept, although I know Dave Saxby thinks differently. There could also have been a chest, or more likely an aumbry, in the slype or passageway next to the south transept. It's easy to forget in our rather static modern forms of religion, but procession was an incredibly important component of worship. As we saw with the labyrinth, physical movement was part of spiritual meditation, and the canons would have processed from the cloisters into the church, richly picking up a book or two on the way. At Lilshall, the aumbry was next to the processional arch, which led straight into the church. But at Merton, that leads into a yard, and it's more likely that the canons processed along the slype and into the church via the south transept. So I feel justified in putting an aumbry in the slype, and I'm going for an aumbry and not a chest, because you don't want to bang your shins. The chapter house would also have had a chest, as the rule of St Augustine and other texts would have been read out at the daily chapter meeting. There probably would have been a chest in the north end of cloisters. This is where books would have been copied to, and there's evidence both paleographical and archaeological that Merton produced, as well as acquired books. And here, the canons would have had carols or booklets to read and write in. These ones are at Gloucester on the left, and on the right, this is Thomas's Minecraft version at Merton. Of course, although this was the south-facing side, and therefore the warmest side, it was nonetheless unglazed and could get a little chilly. An abbot of another monastery, and I'm afraid I forget which one, wrote to a colleague apologising for the tardiness of delivery of manuscripts, because his copyist hands had been freezing all winter. So we'll put also a chest in the infirmary, and we'll give the prior his own private chest, which contained not just a book or two, but muniments vital to the business of Merton. In the 14th century, the prior of Merton was himself accused of breaking into his tenant's muniments chest and stealing the deeds. I've put the prior in the west wing of the cloister. We don't know this for sure, but prior's lodgings were often there, especially in Augustinian monasteries. There would have been an aumbry probably an ordinary, might have been a test, in the refectory, with the week's text to be read out at dinner. This is Bewley Abbey's refectory, now the parish church. Finally, some of the more valuable books and muniments might have been kept in the treasury. At Winchester, the treasury was on the first floor above the slide, and having your treasury between the church and the dormitory was a sensible move because it was relatively well guarded. Winchester's treasury eventually became its library. In the 15th century, technological innovation affected not just the way people learnt, but the physical organisation of books. And that technological innovation was printing. With the increased availability of multiple texts, libraries could expand. By the 16th century, we see the growth of rooms now specifically dedicated to housing a collection and lined with bookshelves, the library as we know it. So if I'd picked Merton circa 1500 for Thomas to recreate and not circa 1300, we might well have had a physical library room. Printing increased another trend which had already begun, and that was the private collection of books. As with everything else in a monastery, books were held communally until about the 15th century, when private ownership became more common. And perhaps we should see this in combination with the growth in privacy generally. This is the period where you start to get partitions, for example, in dormitories. We might discuss that later. For Benedictines, books were lent to brethren once a year in, appropriately, Lent. Monks' borrowing lists are quite revealing. At 14th century Thorning, one monk borrowed the Lord's Prayer for 3 years in a row. Presumably his talents lay elsewhere. The Augustinians were quite a British order. The rule of St. Augustine says that books are to be sought at a certain hour on a certain day. Well, this is quite vague and potentially allows lots of days that books could be lent and borrowed on. Although the 13th century observances from Barnwell Priory, just outside Cambridge, forbid the reading of books in the cloister during service times, this admonition suggests not only that canons did, but also says that they might with the permission of the prior. Elsewhere, the author says that while the priest canons are preparing themselves for private masses, let some attend to the duties assigned to them, and let others take their books and go into the cloister and there read. Bishop Henry Woodlock of Winchester reminded the canons of Southwark in Hampshire that when they were free from divine office, they should always be in the cloister, occupying themselves with the scriptures and other spiritual exercises, and in no way be given the opportunity to wander. Merton's canons seem to have liked their books. Merton's library shows, as a couple of eminent historians have written, the scale of loss of monastic libraries. It's hard to estimate, but Merton would have had one of the bigger monastic collections, probably around 1,000 or so volumes. We have only 30 left. 230 more were recorded in the 14th century by the Oxford Franciscans, but of the rest, we can only guess. I'd like then to focus for the rest of this talk on some of the volumes that we know were in the library and what that shows us about learning in the Middle Ages and a bit about how books survive. Two of our earliest texts are about the founder of the Priory, Sheriff Gilbert, and one of the founding canons, an Italian called Guy. The texts themselves survive in 15th century copies. One historian has suggested that this shows a resurgence of interest in the history of institutions during the 15th century, which included digging up long forgotten stories from the beginnings of those institutions. But I disagree. I think it's far more likely that these texts were so well thumbed during the previous 3 centuries that by the 15th century, they just fallen apart. Vitae, or lives like these, were suitable materials to be read in the refectory, during dinner, or read out a chapter, or for private reading in the cloisters. Both these texts, there's Guy's one in a lovely 15th century bookhand, Both these texts are available from the Merton Historical Society, and they are good windows into 12th century piety. This piety was very affective. Emotions were encouraged as a sign of genuine faith, and certainly Guy was forever weeping at Mass. Guy was an Italian and had previously been a master or director of schools. This doesn't mean a schoolmaster, but somebody more like the vice-chancellor of the university. The schools were higher education establishments, evolving precisely during this period into universities. It seems then that Guy became a canon of Merton later in life, but we don't know how he ended up at Merton. His biographer Reynold, another canon, said that he came as a convert with the others. It's impossible to express how humbly he sought to be received and how devotedly he took up the religious habit. For he pursued the whole process by which novices are advanced into the army of Christ, with many great groans and many tears and sighs. Well, this tells us about effective piety, but it doesn't tell us anything about how he came to choose this new convent of canons. And we don't know which schools he had charge of either, or what his own intellectual interests were. But he carried on the twin academic concerns of teaching and administration, even within the cloister. Indeed, he was sent by 2 bishops to reform and reorder 2 other priories, Taunton and Bodmin, although I'm not going to call them daughter houses for reasons we can discuss. At Bodmin, he met an accident while out riding and died of his injuries in 1124. Although someone of Guy's calibre was unusual amongst regular canons, he was by no means unique. In fact, the Augustinians were in the 12th and 13th centuries rather an intellectual order. Their approach to spirituality was through learning. The major Augustinian thinker of the 12th century was Hugh of St Victor, a canon of the Abbey of St Victor. This was founded by a teacher at the schools in Paris, William of Champeux. William's student and subsequent adversary, Peter Abelard, said rather unkindly that William had founded this monastery to retreat to because he couldn't take the heat of the scholastic kitchen. The Abbey of St Victor was an intellectual powerhouse which was bound up with the formation of the University of Paris, the great European centre for learning in the 12th and 13th centuries. Hugh believed that in order to understand God, you had to understand his creation, that is, everything else. His books were hugely influential and could be found in monastic libraries of all orders throughout Europe, and Merton had at least 17 of his works. Hugh and his abbey are, like Guy, a link between the schools and the cloister. Returning to the life of Guy, bound with it is a treatise by another Augustinian, Alexander Neckham, who was a canon and eventually abbot of Cirencester in the early 13th century. Alexander's treatise highlights something we have to consider when we think about intellectual history. It's very difficult to tell whether somebody is an intellectual unless they've written a book. The only clue that we have of Guy's intellectual background is Reynold's comment about his being a director of schools. And as Reynold is more interested in Guy's religious life, this is just a comment in passing. One of the witnesses to Guy's spirituality and commitment to the religious life was his sub-prior Robert, who became the second prior of Merton following the death of the founder prior, also called Robert. Robert II is another example of, possibly, a scholar whose scholarship we know nothing about. We've one reference to him in a letter from that flamboyant intellectual John of Salisbury to Robert's successor, William. John wrote, "I was delighted to hear of your promotion and see my lord and friend succeeded by the man whom I put second to no one in your whole church for God's honour and the community's profit. God alone, who gave me the power to love, knows the affection I have for your church. I'm confident that by God's grace you will succeed to the charity of the man to whose office you have succeeded, and that I shall have the place in your affection that I used to have in his. It is my real opinion that he reckoned me among his few dearest friends." William compiled a volume of sermons and theological excerpts, which could be used for meditation and reflection, or could themselves form the basis of further sermons. The last of these tracts was a commentary on the Gospel of St Matthew by William himself. To establish the theological quality of this commentary would take further research by somebody better qualified than I, but nonetheless, we have here a busy prior taking an active interest in the intellectual environment of his priory. William's book, now in the British Library, is a large volume, beautifully produced and in lovely condition. Indeed, its condition may help us arrive at its purpose and audience. It's possible that this was for reading out to the brethren during the chapter or mealtimes. It's not been scribbled on for private study like various other of the surviving manuscripts. William's predecessor, Robert, was prior during the deterioration of the relationship between King Henry II and his Archbishop Thomas Becket, which resulted in the latter's dramatic murder in December 1170. Becket was an old boy of and friend to Merton, and his confessor was another canon of Merton and another Robert, but again, we know little about him. One of the reasons that we know so much about Thomas is because a number of his entourage collected together letters and papers pertaining to the Archbishop. One of these collections, a Florilegium or bouquet, was by John of Salisbury and another canon of Merton, another Guy. John, although a secular cleric himself, spent periods of his life as a guest in monasteries. His relationship with Merton was apparently close, and his brother Richard ended his days as a canonman, joining shortly after Becket's death. John's co-florilegist, Guy, became prior of Southwark, taking copies of the Florilegium and other books with him. As prior of Southwark, Guy composed a short treatise on confession, dedicated to William de Vere, Bishop of Hereford, Augustinian canon and friend of Becket. This treatise shows Guy to be firmly in the Salisbury de Vere circle and gives us an impression of the sort of intellectual environment that there might have been at Merton. Guy's books survived the Reformation by being given to St John's College, Oxford. If these were copies of Merton's manuscripts, we have more books to add to our library catalogue. Now, Guy was a much younger man than John, and his priorate at Southwark spans the 1190s and early 1200s. He died in about 1217. By the 1190s, the Archbishop of Canterbury was another friend of Merton's, Hubert Walter. 12th century archbishops of Canterbury were quite good at assembling households of intellectual movers and shapers. Thomas Becket, John of Salisbury, William de Vere were part of Archbishop Theobald's household. Hubert Walter had amongst his householders several noteworthy lawyers. One of these was Richard de Morin's, and in the 1190s he became a canon of Merton. This proved to be but a stepping stone, and he was shortly elected prior of Dunstable. Richard was not the only canon lawyer at Merton at the time. An interesting entry in the Cartulary from 1228 gives an exhibition to one John of Tynemouth to study at a university. The funding for this was via the Priory from a Thomas of Tynemouth, canon, and presumably some close relative, John. We don't know much about Thomas, but in the deeds of the abbots of St Albans, it's reported that in 1235, the prior of Dunstable, Richard de Moris, Thomas de Tynemouth, canon of Merton, important masters who at Bologna and elsewhere had been the heads of schools in Roman and canon law for those who had already completed a course in logic, had helped settle the election of the successor to Abbot William. Here we have two more men who joined Merton as canons after successful careers as heads of schools. Whether they joined Merton together or whether Thomas's residency there attracted Richard is not known. And we don't really know anything about Thomas. There was one other John of Tynemouth who might possibly be of some help. He was a top lawyer, an Oxford master, a papal judge delegate, canon of Lincoln, Archdeacon of Oxford, and opponent of Gerald of Wales. He'd have been in the same generation as Thomas, but his relationship to both Thomas and the younger John of Tynemouth is unknown. Unknown too is the compiler of British Library Royal Manuscript E12. This is a compendium of texts suitable to the study of theology and philosophy. It's from, well, we don't really know. The majority of the texts in this book are from the very late 12th and early 13th centuries. and the handwriting suggests somewhere between 1200 and 1225. But enclosing the first section is this anathema. Master David of London gave this book to the Church of Blessed Mary of Merton. Whoever steals it or in some way causes it to disappear or pawns it or lends it outside the convent walls or deletes or defaces its title, let him be cursed. The only Master David of London whom we know about was the ecclesiastical bureaucrat who died in 1189. It's possible that this section on the sentences of Peter Lombard was written before 1189 and sometime later bound with the rest. But that's by no means certain, and however nice it would be to claim a close relationship between the scholarly bibliophile David of London and Merton Priory, we're not quite in a position to do so. However, this manuscript is itself a scholarly work. One recent historian wrote that its compiler must have been a theologian of discernment. Authors represented include Simon Tournai and Alan Veal, both of whom investigated theological epistemology. It also contains a tract on implicit propositions, which turn out to be rather an important text in the history of medieval logic. Regardless of whoever copied and compiled it, its appearance here shows that Merton kept up with the latest fashions in philosophy. At this point, Merton was also keeping up with the latest theological fashions, as we can see from the Merton Bible, now in Cambridge University Library. The 13th century saw a change in the use and format of the Bible as a result of the 11th century Gregorian reforms and the rise in the 12th century both of the universities and the friars. We nowadays think of the Bible as being one volume, called a candect, but before the 13th century, the various books of the Bible were usually in different volumes, the Lindisfarne Gospels, for example. There were a few single volume Bibles. These are known as Atlantic Bibles because they are absolutely enormous. The 12th century added glosses or commentaries to the various parts of the Bible, which added even more volume and immobility. But by the 13th century, there was a need for a more portable reference Bible, partly linked to the evolution of universities, partly the emergence of friars, partly the increased importance given to sermons more generally. All this saw the birth of the Paris Bible, a candect, usually, with a set order of books and the chapter numbers associated with Stephen Langton that we still use today. The Paris Bible was searchable and with wide margins annotatable. The Merton Bible is a proto-Paris Bible. It's a single volume, but it doesn't have some of the features of the classic Paris Bible. And it's a sum of parts. These were written sometime between 1200 and 1230 by over 30 scribes. This in itself suggests that it was produced in a religious house. Its various parts not only existed, but were used before they were all bound together. And this book has a rich and interesting story. While we can't be totally sure that this Bible was written and compiled at Merton, we can be pretty sure. Excuse me. The Ex Libris you can see here is from the 14th or early 15th century. So it may or may not be a help here. Sure. Excuse me. But the calendar on the other side is definitely from an Augustinian house. It has the right feast days. So I think we can probably use Occam's razor here and assert that this is from Merton. If so, it gives us proof of an active scriptorium, whatever that means, and also of great theological activity, which tallies with the logic manuscript that we've just met. Merton's fondness for theology carried on into the 15th century when it copied or commissioned a fine collection of Robert Grosseteste's theological works. I'd like to suggest that this was done at the behest of Prior Michael Kimpton, an Oxford theologian, who sat on a commission to determine England's policy in the great papal schism of the late 14th and early 15th centuries. The 15th century produced a few more intellectual friars too. John de Kingston, professor of theology, gave his student copy of a scientific compendium. to John Gisborne to help him with his Oxford studies. You can read more about this particular manuscript in an excellent book called The Light Ages. At the beginning, John Gisborne owned another scientific compendium, both of which are now in the Bodleian. How they got there, we have no idea. At the beginning of the 16th century, Friar William Salling was told off by the Bishop of Winchester for spending too much time at Oxford, to the detriment of his convent duties. He and the last Prior of Merton, John Ramsay, might well have been in the circle of men who hosted and befriended Erasmus in England. With even this cursory glance at some intellectual activities of some Merton canons, we can see that Merton was quite a learned place, and that its library was the centre of this. The scattering of the library at the Reformation was far worse than the scattering of the canons, all of whom were given pensions and walked into jobs, and some of whom kept up with each other as well. They seem to have taken as many books as they could with them, and some of these ended up in university and college libraries. One book went to Germany and came back with the monks of the newly founded Ampleforth Abbey in the 19th century. Many monastic books from the British, England, Scotland, and Wales found their way abroad, and it may be that we find them in future in some shady corner of a continental library. The digitisation of library catalogues will help us greatly here, and I'd just like to end by noting another technological advance in the history of the library, the computer. Its databases in the internet have transformed scholarship. My own PhD would have been far less enjoyable had it not been for the digital work of institutions like the British Library, the Bodleian, and various college libraries. I didn't show you the Merton Annals, which were at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. They're fully digitised and meant that I could look at them even during lockdown, an immense privilege, and I really do counsel you to lose a few hours on the popular library website. We'll leave Merton's library in the room that very perhaps became its library, the Treasury. This, and we're back to Minecraft, this is a rare concession to the 21st century. If you click on the book, the Bible on the lectern in front of you, a chest opens which dispenses cake. But please don't tell the fire. Thank you.